gets too hot, right? It gets too hot. So now we've basically reached, or we are reaching a thermal ceiling, right? So you can have more processors, but the processors get so hot that they need to cool down, right? So we are now finding not only those days we had a heat sink, later onwards came a fan. Now we have even what is called water cooling, right? Like a vehicle radiator, we have water cooling on CPUs, right? So the number of transistors are also increasing that way. The performance is also increasing. So is the speed, but now the speed we are going somewhere like 4.5 gigahertz. That's where around what the frequency of processors are, right? What we are doing is we are increasing the number of cores now, right? And the power that's being used is also around the same level, right? And the number of cores since later or mid 2000, around 2005, started increasing. So now the number of cores is going up, right? So that is how computation power is being increased, not by increasing the frequency, but by increasing the number of transistors and the number of cores that can process, right? So this is what the latest I put, or the Intel Core 14th generation uh, processors look like, or the parameters look like, right? So these K series, right, or the 14900K and the KF, these are the most high-end ones, right? So when you're buying a processor, if you go for the K processor, it's going to cost you a lot, right? So if you look at the i9 14 900K processor, it's around 500 or $600. That's about 180,000 rupees, right? So it's almost 2 lakhs. So with tax and everything, when it comes to Sri Lanka, with VAT and everything, expect to pay 250 to 300,000 rupees just on the processor itself. Okay. Um, on the other hand, if you look at something like an i5, right? uh, 14600K. So K is also, if you have an i5, right? You have i 14600U, you have 14, I think 14300 something. You have different types of i5 processors as well, right? So they are different from each other because they have different numbers of cores, different amount of cache, right? And all of this, right? So I'll just go with the i5 14600KF, right? So that is priced around 900, or sorry, 300 into 300 is 90, it's about 90,000 rupees, right? But these are the higher end versions because they are the K and the KF versions. Okay. So the K and the KF versions are the higher end of it, right? So you have the U versions and all of these, which are much, much lower priced, right? So if you look at these K series, you will see that it has, the i9 has 32 cores, right? Sorry, 24 cores, right? And can do 32 tasks at the same time, right? Using something called hyper-threading, right? So you don't have to know what that is. If you take the i5, it has 14 cores and it can run 20 tasks at the same time, 20 threads at the same time, right? The i9 has 36 megabits of L3 cache, right? And the i5 has 24 megabytes of cache, L3 cache, right? The L2 cache again, right, is 32 megabytes. And on the i5, it's only 20 megabytes, right? And the memory capacities, you can go up to 192 GB, right? So typically your computer will have 8 GB or 16 GB, right? But the i9 can go up to 100, all these, the whole series can go up to 192 gigabytes of memory, right? So you need to consider these factors. What is the number of cores? What is the number of threads it can run? L2 cache and L3 cache you need to consider, right? Okay, right. So those are the things that you're looking at. And of course, i14 is the latest generation of processors. They are also the most expensive generation of processors right now, right? So if you thinking of a lesser budget, i13 or the i13 generation, right? And you can have the different types of processors that you have and their cost, and then you can buy one. So just buying an i5 doesn't mean you're getting the best performance, right? Because there are different versions of i5, right? So you have to compare these versions of i5 and see what you actually are getting, right? So this the 14th generation. So it has basically 24 cores for the i9, 20 for the i7, and 14 for the i5, right? And it has 36, 33, and 24 L3 cache, right? And it has support for 192 GB. But if you look at the generation that was 4 generations ago, right? The i9, okay, only had 10 cores. Now it has 32 cores, right? So it has basically, for 4 generations, it has got 3 times more cores. The i7 only had 8. Now it has, I believe the i14 now has 20, right? So it's more than double. Okay. And I don't know whether the memory support is there. Yes, so it doesn't tell you the amount of GB, right? So, yeah, right. So the prices have almost been the same. So if you have an i10, you paid $488, right? And now if you have the i9 in the 14th generation, you're paying about almost $600, right? But if you look at it, an i9, right? The i9 in the 10th generation had 10 cores, 20 threads, right? Uh, it doesn't give you the L3 cache, right? But if you look at the 14th i7, it has, or the i5, it's more powerful than the i9 with the 10th generation, right? So processors are becoming way more powerful because the number of cores are increasing, right? So these are just an example of the Intel processors that you have. AMD also has processors. I don't have a comparison like this. I didn't put it because I didn't want to waste time. But if you look at the current processors, right, how they perform, if you look at it, there's this benchmarking test, right? So you make the processor do a lot of work, right? And you see how fast it can finish that work and things like that, right? So currently the M4 processor, right? M4 Max processor, right? That is by Apple. A single pro performance is about 4060 and multi-core is about 26,000, right? The Ryzen 9, AMD's Ryzen 9, right? 9950X is performing at these levels. The Intel Core Ultra, right? So that is a bit slower than the i9, the 14th generation, right? But the Ultra 9 is performing around these levels. So it's a little bit better than the Ryzen, right? And then M3 Max, right, is performing uh, as good as the Ultra i9 and there's no I, but the Ultra 9 and the Ryzen 9, right? So this is 1 generation older, right, compared to the M4 Max. Okay, so these are the things that you need to, if you're looking at high performance, right? These are the things that you're looking at. So all of these processes are comparatively very much running at the same level, and these are the latest and the top most level processors of these different companies, right? So Apple, AMD, Intel, and then Apple again. Okay. So yeah, right. So that is about processors. So when you buy processors, just don't think I'm going for the best processor, because the best processor is just very expensive, right? You need to go for a processor that you think you can afford, but it also has the features that you're looking for, how much multi-threading that you're going to use, right? Number of cores, right? The L2 cache, L3 cache, right? All of these are very important when you're considering a processor, right? Right. So the next thing, so now we chose the brain of the computer, right? So the brain of the computer is the CPU. So you've chosen what CPU you want to go with, right? So next we look at, okay, we need memory, because after the CPU, memory is the most important component, right? Or we call it the RAM, right? So RAM has been evolving. So when we were using computers, we had SIM and DIMM, right? Single inline memory and double inline memory, right? And later onwards, DDR came, right? Or double data rate RAM came, then DDR2, DDR3. So now we are in the DDR3 and 4, right? Mainly 4. And we are going into DDR5 as well, right? So Intel, the 13th generation and 14th generation support 4 and 5 both. Okay. So RAM has been evolving like this, right? 2000s was DDR, then 2003 DDR2, right? DDR4 has been there for like 10 years now, but it's still very common, right? And now we are moving to DDR5 since 2020, right? And if you look at the transfer rates, right? The transfer rate, the read and write data rates. So this can only do like 200 to 400. But if you look at DDR5, it can do 4,800 to 6,400, right? So it's a massive speed up, right? The peak transfer rate is about 3,200 megabytes per second, or megabytes per second. This is about 84,000, right? So more than almost, I would say 25 or 27 times as fast as DDR1, right? So DDR5 is. So now you need to look at, okay, and the number of pins also are a little bit different, right? So you have to keep that in mind as well. So if you look at this, DDR4 and DDR5 can almost be slotted into the same slot, right? Because they have the same number of pins, right? DDR2 and DDR3 can be slotted into the same slot again, because they have the same number of DIMM pins, right? So most processors nowadays support both of these, right? DDR4 and DDR5, but their data rates are extremely different. Okay. So if you're looking at computers now, maybe you can think of DDR5 as an option if you can afford it, right? So if you compare DDR4 and DDR5, DDR5 uses less, it needs a lesser voltage, right? The power consumption is lesser as well. The speed is, right, so DDR4 is about 3,200 megabits per second. This is about 4,800 megabits per second, right? The performance is also here. You have 4 banks each, right? Bank 0, 1, 2, and 4. Here you have 4 banks, much more denser, right? So you double density. So here you have 16 banks. Here you basically have 32 banks. So they are packed in much tighter, right? And because of that, they are also they can store more data, and they have much higher capacity, and they're also faster, right? um, right, so when you're looking for RAM, you're looking for capacity measured in GB or gigabytes, right? So I would advise, if you're going for a computer now, the minimum you should go for, because if you're running Windows 11, right, the latest version of Windows, the minimum requirement for Windows 11 to run is 8 GB of RAM, right? Which means it's going to use up a lot of that and leave only a very little for other computer programs, right? Or other applications that you're running. So if possible, now, if you're going for a new computer, right, or if you're upgrading your computer, go for 16 GB, right, if you can afford it, okay? And of course, the speed, right? So if you can go for DDR5, right, it's always better because then speed actually matters, right? And also the clock speed, right, or the frequency it can run in, how fast it can read and write in one single in one single second is basically the frequency. So the higher the frequency, the better, because you can read and write more, because that connects to the front side bus of the processor, right? And you can also overclock. I wouldn't advise you to overclock RAMs or processors because they actually uh, heat up the device because they run at a speed higher than they usually normally run, right? But if you really need to, you can do that. But I would advise not to, right? And then the operating system support, right? So operating system can only support a certain amount of RAM sometimes, right? And also it has a minimum requirement of RAM, right? So typically Windows 11 recommends 8 GB of RAM, right? So you want something more than that, right? And when you go for RAMs, also go for warranty. So typically most places nowadays give like 5-year warranty, right? Some places give you lifetime warranty, okay, because the RAM outlasts the entire computer, right? So you can have sometimes lifetime warranty, but most places in Sri Lanka would give you something like 5-year warranty, right? So that's what you're looking when you're looking for RAM. But importantly, what you need to consider is that your RAM or the memory you're buying is compatible with your processor. So if you're buying an I or the 13th, 12th, 13th, and 14th generation of Intel processors, they typically support DDR4, right? And 13th and 14th support DDR5, right? So you have to see if you're going, what processor you're going for, and whether the RAM is supported by that processor generation. Okay. And also then you plug your RAM onto the onto the motherboard, right? Or the main board. So your processor slot has to be the same as what the processor slot is on the main board. So if you buy a processor, you have to buy a compatible motherboard. And you also have to buy memory that is compatible to that motherboard, right? So sometimes the motherboard may support DDR4. If you buy DDR5, you can slot it in, but it won't work, right? So you have to buy a motherboard that supports DDR5, 4 and 5. It also supports processor generations that support DDR4 and DDR5, right? Okay. So that is very important when you buy your processor, motherboard, and main memory, because those are three of the main components, right? Okay. So now, next, what do we get? So now you have the brain of the computer, you have the memory of the computer, right? And you have the motherboard, which connects all these components together, right? Now what you need is you need to store your data, right? So storing data, typically we store data, a lot of data, and we store them in what's called hard disks, right? Or solid state drives, because they are internally fixed on the computer, right? So hard disks are mechanical. So you have rotating disks inside, right, around the spindle, and then you also have an arm and a head that moves the head to the particular location so that it can read data out of it, right? So it's mechanical. So you get different rotation speeds, like 5,400, 7,200, right? RPM, so rotations per minute. That's how fast it spins, right? So 7,200 RPM means a disk spins 7,200 times per second, per minute, right? So RPM, yeah, right? So it spins extremely fast, right? So the faster it means, the faster you can read data, right? So that's one important factor. How fast is your mechanical hard disk or HDD spin, right? The second one is what is the data transfer rate, right? So how fast can you read and write? Okay. So if you're going for a hard disk, ideally you should go for a 7200 because that's the fastest mechanical hard disk you have. If you're going to solid state drives, you have to look at, or even hard disk, how fast can you read and write for those from those drives, right? So here we have a crystal disk mark, a benchmark, what do you call test, right? Done on it. So if you look at this, this is a Seagate 4500 RPM hard disk, right? This is a Seagate 7200 RPM hard disk. These have the same capacity, 160 GB, but they have different hard disk cache, right? So that's not a major issue. So if you look at their performance, this, right, there's a sequential write or sequential read at 61 megabytes per second, right? The 7200 is 83 megabytes per second. Writing, this does 59 megabytes per second. The 7200 does 81 megabytes per second. So generally, it's about 20 megabytes faster writing and reading and writing per minute, per second on these two different speed hard disks. Right? Okay. Now you have hard disks, right? So this is a hard disk, 2 terabyte, 7200 RPM hard disk. You also have SSD drives. They are like a bit like hard disks, the shape, but they're what they have inside is a memory, a card, right? It's like a card. There is no spinning stuff, right? It's not mechanical, right? So this Samsung 950 Evo is one of the fastest or the best performing SSD drives, right? So if you compare the hard disk that spins at 7200 RPM and a SSD drive, you see this writes at 102 and reads at 102, writes at 96. This reads at 557 and writes at 539. All more than 5 times faster than a hard disk, right? But the SSD drive has a limit because it is connected to what we call the what do you call SATA, right? SATA connection. The SATA connection itself has a limit on the speed it can offer, right? So SSD drives are slowed down because they are connected to the normal hard drive port or the hard drive connection, right? So even though the normal hard disk is much slower, the SSD drive can only reach around 500 or 600 because that is the limit of the connection to the drive, right? But to avoid this, SSDs also come in what we call NVMe M.2 flash drives, right? M.2 flash drives. And if you take M.2 flash drives, here the SSD performs, it's connected to a normal hard disk port. It performs at 557. This reads at 2590. So it's 5 times faster than this, right? Here it performs at right at 539. This does it as 1544, right? So it's roughly about 5 times faster reading, right? So if you compare these normal mechanical hard disks and an NVMe M.2 SSD drive, right? 25 times faster than a normal hard. Your computer takes 5 minutes. Sometimes your computer, I don't know, 2-3 minutes to boot, right? To boot up, to start up. A machine with a NVMe M.2 drive will start up in like 10-15 seconds, right? It's a huge difference, right? So if you're looking for laptops or even desktop, if you can afford it, right? Even a small, because SSDs are still a bit costly, right? I think a 512 GB SSD is about 12,000 rupees now, right? A normal 1 TB hard disk probably is about 8 to 9,000, right? So you're paying almost double, little over double the price for per gigabyte still, right? The performance wise, it's much faster. So if you can SSD in your laptop or your desktop, the advantage you get is you install your operating system on the SSD and you store your data on the hard disk or HDD, right? So you can get a 256 GB SSD or a 512 GB SSD, right? And install your operating system on that, and then get a 1 TB or a 2 TB hard disk to store your data. So the machine will start up very fast, right? It will run relatively fast because the operating system is on it. And your data, you can still store data because you have a hard disk, right? So that's what you need to look at now. So if you're going for a laptop, or especially a laptop, right, look for NVMe2, at least a little bit of it, so that you can install your hard disk, install your operating system, and then you have an extra hard disk, like 1 TB or something like that, to store your normal data, right? So price per gigabyte, right? So this is where we are at, right? So this is SSD prices, right? So somewhere down the line, SSDs are going to be cheaper, right, than mechanical hard disks, right? So we are reaching there. So we are still in 2024. We are coming into 2025, 2026 is when SSDs will be cheaper than uh, buying hard disks, right? So don't wait till that time. You'll be in your third year then, or second year rather, right? Second or third year. Okay. One more thing you look at is failure rate, right? How much do hard disks fail or your storage devices fail, right? So typically, hard disks are more prone to shock damage. So if you drop it or something, because it's mechanical, the discs can get scratched, right? Or the heads can shatter, or the arms can get stuck or something, right? So you typically have uh, shock damage, right? And also hard disks are magnetic, right? So if you have a very strong magnet nearby, you can actually damage your entire hard disks and your data, right? Also, SSDs take up less, way less. So SSD, if you drop it, unlikely that you'll damage it, right? But hard disks, definitely, right? An SSD doesn't get really affected by magnetism, right? But a hard disk does, right? The amount of energy needed to drive a hard disk is much higher than the energy needed to drive a SSD, right? And typically, hard disks have more failure rates than SSD. So if you buy a good brand SSD like a Samsung or something like that, right, you're definitely guaranteed better lifetime for your SSD, right? Okay, so this is a comparison of SSDs, right? So this is the most high-end SSDs you all have nowadays. It's a Samsung SSD 950 Pro, right? it's a PCI E3 4 channel, right? One, so it has the highest read write, right? Read write, reading programs or working with programs, and also gaming. So it has typically the highest one, right? And this is the PCI E2, the older version of this. It's much slower, right? If you go for the SSD 850 Pro, it's typically the, what do you call, I think it's the normal hard disk, right? It's much slower. And then you have SanDisk, right? Plextor and OCZ, right? These kind of brands, they perform much slower. So you have ADATA, you have all of these, right? So they might say we are writing as fast as Samsung and things like that, but when you actually install it, you will see they are much less slower and less performance, right? So if you go for the high end ones, you'll have much better performance, right? Okay. Another thing you have is typically if you have smartphones, if you have a camera and things like that, right? If you have video equipment or photography equipment, you need memory cards, right? So you're looking at different types of memory cards. The most common ones you have is micro SD and SD cards, right? So SD and micro SD cards. Mini SD is not that used, but these are what goes in your phone, right? And these are what goes in cameras and video capture devices, right? And in the olden days, they had the compact flash, and Sony had their own type, and XD was by Olympus, right? So they had these type of memory cards. But nowadays, it's typically the SD card that is the most common, right? So you need to look at how much, if you're going for photography, maybe something like 32, 64 GB is sufficient, right? But if you're going for videos, you need to look at 120, 240, those kind of ranges, right? Gigabytes of storage, right? And also the resolution. If you're recording at HD videos, right, it's one type of it takes up some amount of space. But if you're looking for 4K video or 8K video, they're going to eat up your storage really fast, right? Uh, so when you go for, typically, I'm going to talk about SD cards, right? Because that's what's most common, right? And that's the most thing you'll come across, right? You look at the capacity depending on what you're trying to do, right? You look at the specific types, right? So you have class and things like that. I'll show you a table, right? That will explain this. How fast they read and write is very important, because if you're reading, like if you're writing 4K data, right, it's a lot of data that you have to write, right, before the next frame comes in, and that also has to be written, right? So if you're videographing something, right? So the writing speed is extremely important, right? The form factor, right? What type of mini, micro, or standard SD cards, right? Compatible with your cameras, right? And things like that, you need to look at, right? And most storage devices, you need to format it before you can use it, right? And then also formatting these devices, any storage device, right? Whether it's a hard disk or a SD card, depends on the operating system and the device you're using it on, right? So, for example, on Mac OS, they use what's it called? Journal file systems, right? And on Windows, you have FAT32. There's a limit on the size of the file you can store. So then you have to use exFAT, right? Or NTFS, okay, on Windows. So NTFS cannot be written and read from Mac devices. You can read, but you can't write into, right? So there are a lot of limitations depending on the formatting of the device, right? One very important thing is that, especially when it comes to portable uh, devices, right? Like USB sticks or external hard disks, memory cards, and things like that. You can easily lose them. You can forget them, you can drop them, and things like that. And they can also have your personal, very confidential, right? Maybe even secretive data and information, right? So be very, very careful when you store data and you transport that data in devices, right? They can be, the other thing that can happen is if they are damaged, right? It can be a flash drive, it can be a hard disk, right? It can be a memory card, it can be anything. If they're damaged, it's extremely difficult to recover data, which means, let's say you stored photographs of your entire uh, university life, right? For 4 years, you stored all those photographs of all the trips you went, all the friends you met, all the sports you took part in, all the clubs and events, everything that you did, right? All the places you've seen around the university and all of that. All your memories are stored, 4 year memories are stored in a hard disk or what do you call, external hard drive or a pen drive or something like that, and you lose it or it gets damaged. And the thing is, there is no way of recovering that. It's very difficult. I don't mean there is no way. It's possible if you are the right person, but typically, most likely, you've lost it forever, right? So 4 years of your all your memories in digital form is gone, right? So always have backups, right? Always have backups of your data, right? And if possible, on the cloud, right? So the cloud means on, for example, you can store it on Google Drive, right? If you have a Google account, you can store it on Google Drive. So they will be there for as long as Google is there, right? So make sure you make backups of your important data, right? So this is what SD card performance looked like, right? So till around 2000, maybe 12, 15, there were classes. So class 2, class 4, class 6, and class 10. Then came the UHS series, UHS 1 and UHS 3. Then came for videos, right? So V10, V30, V60, and V90. And now you have the SD Express speeds, right? So 150, 300, 450, and 600. So 600, this is the latest one that we have now, right? So if you look at it, what type of video, right? So up to class 10, you could store like standard videos and maybe some HD, right? But if you're going for 4K videos, ideally you go for UHS 3 or V60. If you're going to 8K, right, you need to go for V90, right? If you're going to 8K multi-stream and intra video, so you take multiple shots of the same thing in different angles, and then you have multiple audio and all of that, right? Huge file. Then you're looking at SD Express E600 or E450, that kind of range, right? So depending on what you're trying to do, what type of videos you're trying to record and things like that, you are looking at different classes. So you can't take a class 10 and then put it in 8K video recorder and then expect it to record the data. It'll lose most of the data because it can't take in data that fast, right? So these are the type of things that you need to update. And these technologies keep moving ahead, right? So someday you'll have Express maybe 900, and then you go into another type of format. So, right, so these are the classes, then the UHS, right? And then the video speed, and now we are in the SD Express. Something will come after that as well, right? And of course, you can store stuff in optical drives as well, like CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray discs, and all of that, right? So these are also good, unless and otherwise you get them scratched or you spill something on the site that has the data on, right? So other than that, they're good to store data long term, right? If the quality of the disks are good, you can store them for maybe, I don't know, even 20 years, they'll still work, right? Uh, right. So that is about storing. That's storage. So if you're storing data, how do you store it for a long, long time, right? How do you store it safely, right? And things like that. Okay. So now you have the processor, the brain, you have the motherboard where it's connected to that. You have the memory. Now you have storage. Now what we look at is display, your screens, right? So you have different types of displays, right? So typically what we are going nowadays is HD. You might have 4K TVs, but 4K displays, computer displays are very expensive, right? And of course, 8K is extremely high resolution, right? Also the brightness, depending on the environment you're working in, right? The brightness might be important. Also the color depth. So now we are typically looking at 32-bit true color, right? It actually mimics the color in the environment almost, right? And when you look at contrast, if you have, sometimes you have a black screen, but it looks more or less gray, right? But you want your black screen to be extremely black, right? So then if you have true black, right, you can have a very good, what do you call, uh, it's an extremely good display if you have true black, right? So it blacks out everything that is black. Okay. Also the energy consumption, because you or your parents or the university has to pay the electricity bill, right? The energy consumption of your display is very important. And the last thing is actually the frequency, the refresh rate of your display, right? So typically human eye can, like, if it's like 50 hertz, it can see some flickering, right? It's like turning on and off, like a flicker. It can see some flickering. Around 60 to 70 hertz, 75 hertz, you typically don't see that much flickering. If you're playing games and stuff like that, right, then you're looking for maybe 144 hertz high resolution. But of course, 144 hertz displays are very expensive. They're probably in the, I don't know, 120,000 price. Okay. So why is resolution important, right? So resolution, if you have low resolution, you see you have these pixels. It's pixelated, right? You can see these little squares, right? You can see pixels. If you have a little bit higher resolution, right? You see more detail. If you have very high resolution, you can see very clear detail, right? So you want your screen to be as high resolution as possible, right? So we typically use, when we were students, we had this 480p, right? SD displays. Then came HD or HD ready, right? And then came full HD. So now most monitors we have are at least full HD. If you can afford it, you can go for 4K, which is Ultra HD, and 8K, which is also Ultra HD, right? And these have extremely high detail, right? But of course, most of us can only afford 1080p full HD screen, right? And the types of screens, also CRT monitors are almost not used now. We've gotten rid of most of them. Most of the monitors we have are LCD displays, right? Or liquid crystal display screens, right? So in the university, most of what we have, right, and most of the ones you'll get on laptops and things like that are LCD displays. The new one is LEDs, right? They are OLEDs, right? Organic LED displays, where you have extremely, because each of these pixels is actually an LED, so that they can turn on and off, right? So you can have black as in total black if you turn the LED off, right? And you can also have very bright colors, right? High resolution, high contrast, right? And high brightness, because each of these little dots here, which is a pixel, is a LED itself, right? Light emitting diode, right? It's a tricolor RGB, or red, green, blue LED that emits this light, right? So these are good, but they're, of course, OLED displays are expensive, right? And then, of course, most of us might have come across these overhead projectors, right? Or multimedia projectors, as you call them. And these basically project images and onto a screen, right? And then also you have different types. So you have LCD projectors, you have DLP, or digital light projection, and then nowadays you have laser projection, right? So these are the ones you typically have. And of course, when you have the display, you needed to connect it to your computer. So both the display and the computer should have one of these ports, right? So typically VGA is a bit outdated. Now we use HDMI or display port, right? So these are the ones that are going, right? So HDMI and display port are the most common ports now. You also have digital video interfaces, right? So that's also a port, but VGA and digital video interfacing is kind of now going away, right? VGA is still there, but HDMI is the most dominant port, right? So when you buy a computer, right, you have to check whether you can actually connect a monitor to it, and when you're buying a monitor, you have to check whether your monitor is connectable to your computer, right? And of course, audio devices are depending on the number of channels, right? So mono means you have one speaker, right? You hear the same sound. Uh, Stereo means you have two ears, so you have two speakers that give you two different sounds, right? As if you're listening to surround scenario. Then you have 2.1, which is basically two speakers and a subwoofer. So the bass sound will come from the subwoofer, that's this one. And two speakers act as if they are your left and your right speakers. 5.1 basically means you have a subwoofer. The one is the subwoofer, right? In addition to that, you also have uh, five speakers. One on the left front, right? One in the middle in front, and one on the right front, right? And then one on the left back and one on the right back, right behind. So it feels you're having 3D sound. So sound is coming from in front, from behind you, from the left and the right. It means that you're in three-dimensional sound, right? So 7.1 is another version of it, and 9.1 is another version of that. So it feels that sound is coming from everywhere, right? So these are the number of channels that you need to think of, right? When you're buying, if you're buying an audio system or something like that, right? And then human hearing is typically 20,000 hertz to, sorry, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So within this range, you need to look at, when you buy audio equipment, you have to check whether it fits within this range, right? You have to check whether you need wired or wireless, right? So now people like those ear pods kind of things, right, inside the ear, which you don't want wires fixed on, so you like wireless. But of course, they come with uh, a cost, right? So they are more expensive. So when the battery gets spoiled, you have to throw them out, right? In addition to that, we actually don't know what these radio waves close to our ear are doing, right? close to our brain. So I don't know, right? There are different theories. I don't I don't I don't say I don't believe. I wouldn't say I believe, right? So because I don't have any thing, but if you can avoid it, it's better to avoid, right? So uh, wireless is that, right? And also having these on constantly. Some people have it on all the time, listening to music and stuff like that. Uh, Mind you, it can actually permanently damage your ears, and when you're older, you'll be hard of hearing or you won't have hearing, right? So when you use the especially audio equipment, be mindful of the volume and the how frequently you use them, right? There is research that says these equipment, especially earbuds and headphones, right, can actually damage your hearing permanently, right? Uh, you also have something called noise cancellation, where especially if you're on a call or something, right? And someone you're talking to, it actually has a earphone, that a little microphone that picks out the background sound and subtracts that from the sound you're hearing, right? So it creates an opposite wave, right? So I'll just show what an opposite wave can do. So if you have a sound wave like this, the microphone picks up the background sound and then creates an opposite wave. So when you put these waves together, they basically become zero, right? So that's why noise cancellation works, right? So you can have it in ear, inside your ear, on the ear, and you can have it over the ear, right? So over the ear means you're blocking out all the sounds around. Okay. Right. Okay, so these are the types of equipment you can have. And then the next thing we look at is, okay, so now you have the processor, you have the memory, you have the hard disk for storage. They're all connected on a motherboard, right? And then you have a display. If you have a keyboard and a mouse, your computer will typically work, right? If you give power, of course, right? But sometimes you need, right? You have to take assignments, right? Nowadays, most of the assignments we take it online, but sometimes printed assignments, you have to submit reports, right? You might have to submit your research report or thesis, right? So you have to do this. So then you look at printers, right? So when you look at printers, you have to first look at the technology: dot matrix, ink, or bubble jet printers, laser printers, and plotters, right? So dot matrix is when you actually need things, carbon copies, or you want cheap printing, like in a supermarket or somewhere, right? Or a government office or the Shroff office or something like that. You look at dot matrix printers, right? Inkjet, they're the cheapest printers, right? They're quite cheap. You can buy them for something like 6,000 rupees or something like that, right? But the thing with inkjet is, inkjet printer manufacturers don't earn by selling the printer. They earn by selling ink, right, for the printer. So when you buy ink, it's more expensive, right? And also, if you get water on it on a bubble jet printout, most of the time it smudges and the color runs, right? So bubble jet is cheap for color printouts, but it's economically it's not that viable, right? It's not that good. And then if you're looking at laser printers, of course the print is more expensive. You have typically black and white or black printers, right? But you can also have laser color printers. They are the expensive side, right? But uh, if you're looking for high quality prints, but you don't print color that much, then a laser printer is, on the long run, it's one of the cheapest to use, right? And then if you want to print things like banners and things like that, you're not going to do that. Most of the time you go to a shop that does printing, right? And they do these large prints. They are done on these devices called plotters, right? And of course, when you print, you want to look at dots per inch, right? Resolution. Again, how much detail do you want on your print, right? So dots per inch is that. And the speed of printing is how long the first print takes to be printed out and how many pages can you print per minute, right? So if you have to wait for a long time to get your print out, that means it's going to have a low pages per minute speed, right? And also cost per print. So when you buy ink, jet, right, and laser printers, the cost per print might be much lower. How do you calculate this? You basically calculate how many prints can you print with a toner and how many prints can you print with a drum. What is the cost of a toner? What is the cost of a drum? And then you divide it by what each can print. Then you get the cost per print, calculate which is the cheapest print for me, right? Prints per cartridge or prints per toner is calculated by 5% coverage. So if you have a, right, if you color 5%, right? Because when you write letters, it doesn't take up that much space, right? So if you type stuff like this, if it covers 5%, that's what they say that okay, for toner cartridge can give you I don't know 3,000 prints at 5% coverage, right? So if you do it at 10%, it's only going to give you 1,500 prints, right? If you do it at 50% coverage, it's only going to give you 300 prints, right? So the more toner you use, the less number of prints. So they typically calculate at 5% coverage. And also the connectivity. So typically we look at using USB. We can also look at LAN connection, right? Local area network. So it's a wired connection using a network cable. You can also have AirPrint, so you can directly connect your phone over Wi-Fi or Bluetooth and then directly print. And then you can also connect it to your Wi-Fi network, right? And then you can print, okay? So that is connectivity. So these are what other printers look like. You have inkjet, you have laser printers, and then you have these large plotters, okay? Right. Some of the main components that we might want to buy, right? And we were talking about a motherboard, right? So a motherboard for the computer. So when you look at the motherboard, right, it needs to, motherboard is, I don't know whether I have a picture of a motherboard. No, maybe I think I showed you in last week's lecture, right? It needs to be able to connect the processor that you're buying, right? So it should have the processor support. It should be able to connect the memory that you're buying. So the memory and the processor supports certain type of memory. So the 13th generation, for example, or the 14th generation of Intel processors support DDR4 and DDR5, which means these two are related. So the main board should be able to support the 13th or the 14th generation processor, as well as it should also support DDR4 or DDR5, right? And also, if you want to have a lot of memory, you should need to have uh, a lot of memory slots. So typically, we look at least 4 memory slots now, right? Those days it used to be 2, but now we are looking at least 4 slots. Right? Also, the type of power connectors, because sometimes your processor needs a lot of energy, right, to run. So you need different types of power connectors. I'll show you a power connector as well, right? And then secondary connectors, like you need to connect your SSDs, right? Then you need to have an NVMe slot, right? NVMe M.2 slot, right? If you want to connect an SSD. So your motherboard nowadays, you want to check whether your motherboard has a NVMe M.2 slot, right? If you want to connect hard disks, you can have SATA, or SATA is what you have. You don't have IDE anymore, SATA ones. And also, if you want to have PCIe Express M3, right, slots to connect, right? And then expansion slots are where you connect your network cards, right, or your graphics card, right, or your sound card, right? Anything that is not on the motherboard and you want to connect more performance equipment, right? You want to give more performance for your uh, computer, then you need to connect these cards onto expansion slots, right? Uh, so then these expansion slots are very, very important, right? So graphic cards, network cards, sound cards. If you want to capture video or something, you have capture cards, right? So all of these have to be connected, right? And then you also want these front and rear connectors, so USB, audio, right, and all these stuff, right? And sometimes you have onboard graphics, sometimes you have onboard sound, onboard network, right? So that means you don't need to buy these graphics cards or network cards or sound cards because you have them on the motherboard itself, right? So these are the type of ports that you can have on your computer, on your motherboard. So this is called USB type A, right? And then now we are looking at typically USB type C, right? USB type C is what we are looking at. So now if you're buying a computer, because all equipment is going in this direction, USB type C direction, right? So, but sometimes you have old pen drives, old hard disks that you need to plug in. So you still need to have some USB type A kind of ports, right? But if you're buying computers, you also need to know that nowadays you also need some USB-C ports, right? Because new equipment, right? For example, if you have a Samsung phone or something, right? It connects on USB-C, right? So you want USB-C ports and USB-A ports, right? If you want to connect monitors and stuff like that, you want a HDMI port, right? If you're connecting to the network via a wire, you want a Ethernet or a LAN port, right? And then, of course, you want sound. You're looking for a microphone and a speaker, audio out and an audio input. So these are the things that you're looking at, okay? And these ports are now kind of obsolete. You don't have serial ports and parallel ports anymore, right? But these ports are still there, right? And IEC cord is the type of cord we have when we connect power to our current computers, right? RJ11 is when you connect your telephone line, right? If you have an old telephone line at home, RJ11 is what you connect it. If you're connecting it to your LAN network, RJ45 is the one you're looking at, right? And also now we talk about USB, right? So USB 1 is very slow, right? So it's only 12 megabits per second. USB 2 was 480, right? So typically the normal USB ports. USB 3 is 5 gigabits per second. USB 3.1, right? Generation 2 is about 10 gigabits per second, right? And now you have USB-C, right? So USB-C is what we connect most of our equipment in new equipment. That's about 20 gigabits per second, right? So we now look at typically having these set of ports, USB-C and USB type A, but generation 1 and 2 of 3.1 and 3.2, right? So these you need to look at. How many do you need at the back of your computer, in front of your computer? How many does your laptop have? These are important facts, right? And then, of course, you can look at connectivity. So typically we look at Wi-Fi now, right? And also sometimes Ethernet, right? So LAN network connected via cable. You also look at Bluetooth connectivity, right? So Bluetooth, the version going now is 5. So if you're buying a laptop or desktop or something, look at Bluetooth 5, right, as an option. And these are the type of networks you have. So typically we are on nowadays we are on Cat 6, right? Cat 6, Cat 6E, and Cat 6A, right? These are the LAN networks that we connect. If you're looking at Wi-Fi, you're looking at this, right? You are looking at N is a bit, yeah, 2009 is a little bit old, right? So you're looking at AC and AX, right? So you're looking at 14 and 2019, right? So this is what you need to look at. So 8.2.11ax is what you should look at if you're buying a Wi-Fi device, right? And then finally, almost at the end, right? We are looking at, we have 120 minutes, right? So we are looking at 3 o'clock. So I have half an hour more. Okay. I was just worried I was coming up on 90 minutes, right? So we have time. Right. So if you're looking at computer, we also need to look at a power supply. Most computers use about 200 to 350 watts, right? Most computers. That's perfectly sufficient for the processor, the memory, the other keyboards and mouse, right? And maybe some network cards and stuff like that, right? To run 300, 200, yeah, around 300 to 350 watts is perfectly enough. But if you're connecting what's called a GPU, a graphics process unit or graphics processing unit, right? That will take up a lot of energy, right? Or a lot of power. So then you're looking at 650 to 1,000 watt power supply, right? So if you're building your computer during when we were students, right? When we could afford it, right? We actually built our own computers. So we got a casing to put this thing. We bought the motherboard, we bought a processor, we bought RAM, we bought hard disks, right? We bought the power supply, right? We bought the keyboard and the mouse and monitor and everything, and we put the thing together. Nowadays, most of you go buy a laptop, right? You can't even remove a laptop now, right? Uh, because the RAM is on the board, the hard is soldered onto the board. They, right? You can't basically do anything. You can't even upgrade sometimes, right? But typically, yeah. So if you're planning to assemble your own gaming computer or your desktop or something, you're looking at wattage. Depending on if you're fixing a GPU or something, you have to look at what wattage the GPU needs and what wattage does your processor and all the other equipment need. So if you might be looking at something like 650 to 1,000 watt power supply in that case. Oils, 350 power supply should be perfectly fine, right? You also look at number, the power supplies power connector, right? So it's typically the 20 to 24 pin ATX connector should plug in to your motherboard. If your motherboard has a different type of uh, ATX or power connector, right, it won't work. So when you buy your power supply, you have to check what connector your power supply has and the motherboard has, right? So it's very important that they are compatible. All right. Okay, so the question what you have is what is the best device for me, right? So the first thing I would tell you is know your budget, or rather know your parents' budget. How much can they give you, right? Because already it's very difficult for them, right? So I know some people only have 2 meals a day, right? It's a reality, right? Those days, if you used to I don't know, buy what you want and eat some snacks and have extra cups of tea and stuff like that. Now many people don't do that because they can't afford it. They can't afford the basics, right? So be very mindful when you ask money from your parents or whoever, right, is going to fund you. So because it's like this, when you ask from your parents, it's a pressure on them, right? Because they know, okay, my daughter or my son is going to university now. He needs a computer or she needs a computer. I have to find money from somewhere. So they might take the earrings of their ear or the bangle of their hand or the chain of their necklace of their neck, right? And then keep it at the bank or some pawning shop and then get the money, right? Or they might borrow the money from someone, right? So you're basically adding pressure to them, right? So be very mindful before you ask for money, especially from your parents, right? If you are doing a job, right, or you have the money, then it's fine, right? But still, think of the long run, right? So don't buy or don't think of or don't plan for a machine beyond your budget, right? Think of what can I afford or what can my parents afford? What is the minimum I can spend, right? Or always think what's the lowest I can spend and buy a computer for myself, right? Um, so what are you going to use it for? That's the first next question, right? What is your budget and what are you going to use it for? Is it just basic computing like browsing the internet, doing documents and stuff like that? Then you can go for a low level computer. If you're looking for things like programming and stuff like that, right? You can go for a computer that is a little bit higher because you need to compile your programs and things like that. It takes up a bit of computation power. So you go for a little bit higher computer, right? If you're into graphics, then you need a graphics card, right? So then it's a little bit more complex than programming, right? If you're into gaming, right? If you're into gaming, then it goes beyond that. If you're into machine learning and artificial intelligence, then you need to look at very high computer, very high cost computers, right? Some which you can't afford. Then you can actually look at using free services like Google Colab, right? Or the department has some computers that you can use, right? The Department of Statistics and Computer Science. They have some high performance computers that you can use, right? So then you can look at those kind of things, right? Okay. Because if you're looking at a graphics card, right? A graphics card would start at something like 80,000 or something for a low-end graphics card and can go up to about uh, 3 million rupees, right? I think the A100, I don't know how much it is, right? So I can just, give me a second, I can just Google what the price of A100 is. Uh, yeah, so it is about $8,200, right? So $8,200 is about 2.5 million. Yeah, so 8 into 3 is about 24. 24, yeah, let's say 25,000, 250,000. Yeah, it's about 2.5 million rupees just for a graphics card, right? So that's how expensive graphics cards can be, right? So it can be in the price of maybe uh, 60 to 80,000, or it can be 2.5 million. right? So be mindful, right? Don't go for the 2.5 million. Even the university, I don't think the university has any A100s, right? So we have an A2000, but not an A100, right? So the A2000 is in a computer that costs 3.5 million rupees, right? It was fund given by the American, what do you call, the US Air Force gave us a grant. So that machine was bought from that, and it cost about 3.5 to 4 million with a A2000 graphics card, right? Okay, so think of the budget and think what you're going to do with it, right? And then what is the best device in a sense? The ports and the architecture. Are you looking for to be able to run Windows and Linux? Then you need to go for a PC build, right? If you're thinking of, okay, I'm okay with Mac OS, right? Then you can go for uh, an Apple computer, right? And also the software you use, depending on what software you're going to use, right? So if your software is 32-bit, now there are some old software that are 32-bit, but you still need to run it. Then you need to think of your computer being able to run 32-bit legacy software, right? But most of the time you're thinking of running 64-bit applications, right? And also mobility and flexibility, right? Do you want to walk around it? Do you want to take it for lectures? Right. I've heard that some lecturers don't not allow, but rather don't prefer computers in their classes. Right. But for example, my class, I don't mind if you bring a laptop or a tablet or anything, right? To take your notes down or anything, that's perfectly fine. But as long as you don't disturb the other people around you. Like, for example, if you open up Facebook, right? Or TikTok or something on your, let's say, your laptop or something, right? And the person behind you and all the people behind you are going to be looking at that and not listening or paying attention to the lecture, right? So be mindful of what you do. But if you ever come to my lectures, you're most welcome to bring any device you want, right? So I've seen some students, they take notes on tablets, right? Which is good because they're saving paper in a way, right? Uh, yeah, so it depends on what you want, right? So smartphones, tabs, and laptops, you can't almost upgrade them. They're very limited now. Desktops are more customizable, right? You can upgrade it, you can change stuff, right? You can reuse stuff and all of that, right? And if you take a laptop, it costs much more, right? So an i7 laptop might cost about right, with that 16 GB of RAM, right, an SSD and an i7 13 generation laptop, maybe about 400 to 450,000, right? But if you take a desktop, an i7 desktop, right, with 16 GB of RAM and same amount of hard disk space and all of that, it would be about 270,000, right? So much less price, right? 270. So it's almost maybe half the price or a little more than half, right? So depending on what you want to do. And of course, nowadays, tablets cost as much as a laptop. Like, for example, the iPad Pro, right, would cost somewhere like, I think, almost 600,000. So you can buy a laptop for the price of a tablet, but then the tablet is nowadays are very powerful. You can write stuff and you can do all the things you do on a laptop or a desktop, right? So yeah, anyway. Okay, so that's also an option if you can afford it. Then it also depends on what operating system you want, right? So uh, typically Windows, Mac OS, and Windows are the most intuitive operating systems or interfaces to use, right? Quite relatively quite easy, right? To use. Okay. But Linux, if you get used to it, if you're, I would say if you're doing computer science or something like that, you have to be on Linux, right? We used to be on Linux, right? But then 2000, not 2007, maybe about 2008 or something, I moved on to Mac, right? And then from Mac, I just kept on Mac, right? But of course, I can still use most of the Linux commands and Linux stuff if I go to the command prompt, right? So if I can type in all the commands, even on a Mac, I can use most of the Linux stuff, right? Because uh, uh, Mac OS is built on something very similar to Linux, right? So it works fine. So you have more control on Windows because you can get more applications and things are built for Windows, right? But of course, if you go onto the command line on a Mac OS, you still have the power of a Linux computer, right? So Linux, you can basically do anything because it's free and open source, right? So you can change the code and build your own version and stuff like that. It's also free, right? Because Windows, you have to pay for it, right? And Mac OS, you buy it with the computer, right? So you can't change anything or anything like that, right? So it also depends on what software you want to run, right? For example, certain software you can't run it on Mac or Linux. You only can run it on Linux, Windows. Certain software you can run it on Mac, but you can't run it on Windows or Linux. And there are certain software you can only run it on Linux. You can't run it on Windows or Mac OS, right? So it depends on what software you're using as well, right? So all of these, so you have to think of what operating system you want, what is the flexibility and the mobility you want with your device, right? Is it okay being at home or do you want to carry it around, right? Do you want to take notes on it? Then you're thinking of like a tablet or something, right? Also, the kind of architecture in your system, right? The operating system, the applications that you use, right? And then finally, or most importantly, what you're going to use it for and the budget, right? The amount of money you can afford, right? If you can afford only 100,000 or 50,000 or 150,000, right? Just because you can afford 450,000, you shouldn't go for 450,000, right? You have to go for something according to your requirement. Okay. So we are on a webinar, which means uh, let me check. Right? So if you have any questions, I think you can raise your arm, right? Yes, we have a question. Yeah, so you can talk, Kavindu, was it? Yeah, since you have your hand up, you can ask a question. So anyone who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand and I can let you all ask questions. Kavindu, your mic is mute. You have your hand up, so. Okay. Put his hand down. So anyone else has questions? But the silence seems no. What you can do is you can think about this if you are planning to buy a computer upgrade or something like that, right? And if you want any help or advice regarding these stuff, you can always come to the department and you can ask for help, right, or guidance, and we'll help you select the computer you want or create a specification or help you choose. Okay. Right. So thank you for joining this webinar, right? And hope it helps you in your long run in the university. Maybe you take computer science as a subject, or maybe you don't. It doesn't matter, right? Good luck with the rest of your lectures, and also the next 3 to 4 years that you spend at the University of Peradeniya at the Faculty of Science, right? Hope it's fruitful and that you get something out of it, and that you aspire to learn, develop yourself, right? You may not speak good English now, but I hope that you put in an effort to speak well, present yourself well, right, in English by the time you leave, right? So develop yourself. No one is coming and going to give it to you in a platter, right? And say, okay, this is what. And don't think of this as a piece of paper or a qualification, right? Just to have it so that you can get a job or something like that. No. Think of this degree opportunity, right, as a thing to develop yourself to be a better person, a more knowledgeable person, a more intellectually developed person, right? So that you go out of university a much better person, right? And who will actually give back to society, because society is going to, it paid for your, most of your education, right? That you got school uniforms, from school books, right? All the 12 or 13 years that you went to school, right? The roads you used, right? The maybe the subsidized school season ticket in the bus, right? All of this was from the people of Sri Lanka, right? From the people who pay tax even for a toffee they buy at the shop, right? So all of them have contributed to your education. So spend these 4 years, because they will be still spending on you, right? When you come out of university, come out as a better person and then contribute back to the country and the society that has spent so much on getting you where you are, right? Okay, so good luck with the rest of the your university life, right? And most of us will meet somewhere down the line, right, at the department or faculty or somewhere, right? Okay, so thank you very much for joining this session.